move this. Okay, the book of Revelations, chapter 6, is about the four horsemen, the rider on the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, the pale horse, and their connection with just about everything. Daniel 11, Isaiah 28, Psalms 83, Isaiah 17, Jeremiah 49, Isaiah 22, Zachariah 5, Ezekiel 38, and they're just the ones that I've got into. There could have been more, okay, like Isaiah 10 and so forth, but I think that would be enough for one lesson. In fact, the book of Daniel will actually be further explained when we do Revelations 12. So you're going to have to wait till then, yes. Some view Revelation 6 as already occurring, and they demonstrate it by some things that have happened throughout history, and that, that's plausible. But this study is from the perspective of Revelations 1 verse 10, which is where John says this is about the Lord's day. Remembering that in Greek it actually means day of the Lord. Then we're going to look at Mark 13. Now that's important because Mark 13, even Matthew 24, if you read it just English one verse after another, it does tend to disagree with Revelations chapter 6. For example, in Mark 13, 24, it says, "But in those days after tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven shall fall," which we read of right there in Revelations chapter 6. And then the very next verse is, "And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds." And people are like, wait, so does that mean that's the end in the middle of it? And so forth and so on. So we're going to go through and just kind of break that down. And you'll see that when he says, "And then they'll see the Son of Man coming," he's putting it in order of a time frame, not what happens straight after another. But like I said, we're going to get there. So Revelation 6 verse 1. "Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a white," that's important. In earlier sessions, we talked about the fact that white there is leukos. It comes from the word light. So it's a white horse. "And he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." Why white horse? This is actually important because he appears to be righteous. Nowhere does he actually the writer actually is called righteous, but the appearance is righteous. Okay, more than likely, this writer is Torah observant, or at least very big on the Abrahamic faith. Okay, because as we read on, you're going to see that certainly the Jews will believe that this person is their Messiah, and even the Muslims will believe that this is their Mahdi, and they will only follow somebody who follows Abrahamic literature like Torah or the Quran. Again, there's no mention that the writer is actually righteous. This is a perfect picture of the synagogue of Satan. Righteous acts, but no love equals no godliness. Now, it does say that he was able to go out and to, is conquering and to conquer. And we're going to consider Daniel 9:27, where it says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." But, the misconception is there that it's a peaceful covenant, but it never says that. It just says, "And he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week." And we're going to get into Daniel 11 quite a lot. And it talks about it's probably by forceful deceit. Okay. And, in Daniel 9:27, I know some have related Daniel 9:27 actually to Leviticus 26, which is actually plausible, how the Messiah was on earth 2,000 years ago, and he fulfilled in some respects, especially in the Hebrew, you can actually say that he made a covenant with many, as in Rav. The Hebrew word there is he makes a covenant with Rav. we get the word rabbi from the word Rav. So we could actually say that he made a covenant with the great ones. And there are many who believe that the great ones are actually Christians under the new covenant. So Daniel 9:27 says in Hebrew, and it's plausible that maybe that is just a covenant with believers. However, when Jesus was speaking about it in Mark 13, it was a distant future. Okay, so whilst, yes, it may have elements that were satisfied 2,000 years ago, like we've explained before, prophecy is certainly multi-dimensional. I mean, isn't all the word of God multi-layered? Absolutely. So who are the likely candidates? Now, I'm not going to out people, but I just want you to be aware of what's going on right now, okay? In Daniel 11, we find that there is a king of the north. Some scholars believe that it is the Russia, Turkey, and Iran alliance. Now, if you can see the picture there, this is only on the 5th of May. So this was just a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago. Now, the picture that the article used is an old picture. Okay, so I don't want to be forthright or unforthright. Sorry. So that picture is definitely an old picture, but the article is the 5th of May, 2020. And there is talk right now in amongst Russia, Turkey, and Iran, which was unheard of like a decade ago, that they want to get together and they're considering removing Assad from Syria. And we'll get to the significance of that later. So you've got the king of the north, which in other sectors, I guess other sections you can call Magog and Gog. This is the second of 4 beasts mentioned in Daniel 7 verse 5, where it says, and therefore before me was a second beast which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and this is interesting, and it had 3 ribs in his mouth between its teeth. Okay, so the combination of the 3 there. It could later include Syria, but unlikely, and I'll explain why later. But this really kind of demonstrates, and we're going to read this through Daniel 11, that there are actual several steps of Magog. And later on, the 4th beast gets rid of all of them. All right, but we'll get there. The king of the north, specifically what later becomes known as the Antichrist, is very likely an Assyrian. It actually says in Isaiah 10 verse 5 that Assyria is used for judgment in those end days. So we get from that the Antichrist will be an Assyrian. What some people don't know, though, is that Abraham was actually called an Assyrian. He came out of Assyria from the land of Ur. It's called the land of Chaldees. And so that was just the earlier slide. We're talking about the fact that, yeah, he needs to be either a Jew or at least an Arab from the lineage of Abraham. So for anyone to kind of accept him. Yes, Ishmael is a child of Abraham. Need to bring this up pretty quickly. So God actually said to Abraham that he would bless him, and anyone who curses Abraham would be cursed. Anyone who blesses Abraham would be blessed. People forget the fact that Ishmael is actually from Abraham. And even though there's a lot of issues with certain religions, that doesn't mean that we should curse a people. Okay? You can disagree and come against evil religions, but let's never ever forget that both Ishmael and Isaac came from Abraham, and God made that promise to Abraham before he had Ishmael and Isaac. So we need to watch our mouths before we curse certain people groups. So in this case, the Antichrist would be an Assyrian. So just simply for the fact that they could be accepted by the Jews and the Muslims, but this Assyrian comes out of the north. Now, this king of the north makes alliances by deceit, and it says, and he distributes spoils. So let's get through this. This is most likely when Yaakov's trouble begins. It's called Jacob's trouble. And this is what it says. It says, in this place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given, and he shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. All right. So even he's going to win over Israel here. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. Okay. So this is forceful deceit that I was just speaking about earlier. And he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province. Now, you notice there, the whole province. That's important. Okay. And he shall do what neither his father nor his father's father have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. Basically, he just enters it, he conquers it, and then everyone just loves him because he just gives out treats. He shall devise plans against strongholds. So he's always battle aware, okay? But only for a short time. This is potentially Psalms 83. Now, in Psalms 83, it has Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the area of Gaza. Now, you'll notice that Egypt, Persia, Turkey, and Russia are excluded. They are rising for the purpose to, in inverted commas, to cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. There is no mention of these particular nations actually attacking Israel. And it's possibly because they have been sorted out here. Because remember, he, without warning, comes into the richest parts of the province, the entire area. He conquers the whole area. And in Isaiah 17, it says, see, Damascus will no longer be a city. Some people are like, oh yeah, no, Israel is going to take out Damascus and there's going to be a big fight between Israel and Syria. We don't see that here. In fact, Isaiah 17 verse 3 appears to confirm that it's definitely not Israel that destroys Syria. Because in Isaiah 17 verse 3, it includes Ephraim. So Damascus and Ephraim get injured, get ruined in that particular prophecy. But it's very plausible that a certain king from the north comes and takes out that area. Let me go down, go this way. Oops, sorry. So why would the prince of the covenant, that's the leader of Israel, make an alliance with the king of the north? Well, possibly because the king of the north has helped stabilize the Middle East. Now, in Jacob's trouble in Jeremiah 30, verse 7, it doesn't mention any timeline, okay? But what we do know is the reason why it's called Jacob's trouble is because it begins in Israel. And it is most likely the final week mentioned in Daniel 9. All right? Which is interesting because when people talk about the covenant with many, they always say it's going to be for 7 years. That's not necessarily true. It will end up being 7 years, but it could just be a covenant with many, and it's God who has said, this is your last 7 years. But I'm quite comfortable if I see a covenant with many occur and it doesn't specifically mention 7 years, that doesn't ruin any kind of timeline. All right, because it's God who's allocated that 7 years, not necessarily has to be on a document somewhere. So this is what brings us to the first horseman, he makes war, he conquers the province, he conquers the Middle East, and he makes alliances with Israel. Again, this could be the connection to Daniel 9:27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many in the entire province by forceful deceit. And I've already spoken about the fact that it could be related to Leviticus. Oops. Part of the alliance, this is the interesting part of the alliance most likely would include rebuilding the temple. Now, the temple location is not where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. If you do a lot of research on this, a lot of scholars now believe it's right next to it, just down a little bit. So you could have the temple and the Islamic mosque side by side, possibly as a symbolic peace gesture between the two main religions. who have now been united somehow. In Daniel 8:13-14, it talks about 1,150 days, or in the Hebrew, it says 2,300 evenings and mornings. All right. The reason why it says evenings and mornings, in English it says concerning the daily sacrifices, right? Is because this is about the Tamid sacrifice. And in the Tamid sacrifice, without getting too technical on you, sorry, but in the Tamid sacrifice, there's a sacrifice in the evening and there's one in the morning, okay? So in Hebrew, it says for 2,300 evenings and mornings. In some translations, they have said that it's 2,300 days, but in the Hebrew, it definitely says for 2,300 evenings and mornings, all right? So I'll start from the top and we'll work our way through this, but just be aware of that. So in Daniel 8:13-14, it says, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices? That's really important because that is what the emphasis is. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices? And the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, or rather 1,150 days. Then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Okay. The sacrifices will run for 1,150 days. That's the giving of the sanctuary. And then the sanctuary will be cleansed by God's wrath. Not, after 2,300 days, the sanctuary will be cleansed. These are two separate sentences. It's saying that sacrifices will be reinstituted. The sacrifices will last for 1,150 days. Then something's going to happen and the sanctuary will begin its cleansing. Move it on. All right, so what the alliance and the covenant with many actually is. And we find this in Isaiah 28, verse 13-15. It says that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and caught. Therefore hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men, who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. That's the Prince of the Covenant. For you have said, we have made a covenant with death and with Sheol. We are in agreement. Okay, interesting. Because we soon find out that this annulment is null and void in the fourth horseman. Okay, remember Isaiah 28:18. It says your covenant will be annulled and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it. Now the fourth horseman, and the name of him who sat on it is, surprise, surprise, death and Hades. It goes, and then the power was given to them over the fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. The scourge that passes through, it says, then you will be trampled down by it. Well, in Daniel 11, verse 40, it says, he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. So you can start to see here that what we're talking about with the fourth horseman is actually death and Hades connected to Isaiah, the agreement that they made at the very beginning. Remember Daniel 9:27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined, which is poured out on the desolate. What does that mean? Because that can be complex. Basically, it's the treading of the holy city for 42 months. And the two witness testimony that we read in Revelations 11, 1-6. And basically that lasts until the very last trumpet, which begins the 10 days of war. And that's called the 10 plagues. All right, so we're going to go back now. Revelation 6, verse 3. So that was an overall, okay? In Revelation 6, verse 3, it says, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. Then Revelation 6, verse 4, another horse fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, that the people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. Now, it is at this point that it is likely that Israel thinks it has an alliance, especially with Egypt. They then attack Elam, which just happens to be in Persia, in Iran. Okay? So Persia Elam is attacked in Isaiah 22 verse 6, where it says, Elam bore the quiver. And then in Jeremiah 49, it says, against Elam, I will bring the four winds, the four quarters of heaven, and scatter them towards all the earths, towards all those winds. There shall be no nations where the outcasts of Elam will not go. Surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, Elam is actually the location of the Iranian Bushehr nuclear reactor. And this attack may be what causes the king of the north to retaliate. So the first passage that we've just seen is the king of the north making alliances. He takes over the province, he makes alliances. Everyone thinks that everything is sweet. Then the second seal is broken, creating mass war where people should kill one another all over the world. And part of this is where Israel decides to possibly attack Elam. Now, because Elam is part of Persia and they've got a special agreement there, Iran and Russia and Turkey, they retaliate. All right. So in Daniel 11, 25 to 27 is where we see this. And it says, and he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south. Remember, he's just been there. He's conquered it. Now he's gone back. And now he stirs up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army. That's what we see in the Elam prophecy. But he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. All right. So the king of the south loses. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, this is interesting. As for the two kings, their heart shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for their end is yet to be at an appointed time. So after all this casualties, why would they be sitting at the same table talking? Because they still have an alliance, a Daniel 9:27 alliance that ends up being for 7 years, all right? Or at least that's the intention. That's the last 7 years. So they've still got this alliance going on, even though they're trying to kill each other. So Elam is destroyed, the king of the north attacks, and this is probably where we see the Ezekiel 38, where the Russian alliance, that's Russia, Iran, several of the smaller states, smaller former Soviet states, that's Meshech and Tubal. You've got Ukraine, you've got Turkey, Ethiopia, and Libya, all attacking in response to Elam, more than likely. You will notice that there's no mention of Egypt here. Possibly the king of the south is probably a more aligned Israel and Egypt alliance. And if you go through prophecy, you'll see that God actually rewards Egypt later. Anyway, but they lose. So then the king of the north returns to his own land, but he is still angry at the holy covenant, Israel. And we read that in Daniel 11:28. And he shall return to his land with great wealth. Where did he get that from? But his heart shall be sent against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will. It actually means that he just keeps on murdering, and he returns to his own land. And this is where Zachariah 5 comes into it. So war is now all over the place. This is the second writer, remember. And in Zechariah 5, verse 2 to 3, it says, so I answered, I see a flying scroll. The word there actually means roll. Its length is 20 cubits and its width is 10 cubits. Someone pointed out a few years ago to me that that's pretty much what you would find a missile look like, right? Then he said to me, this is the curse that goes out over the face of the earth. And as you read Zechariah 5, you see that these long rolls fly and go all over the world, okay? So A lot of scholars now, as they read the Hebrew, think that this is actually nuclear war going on right there. And so the third seal is the outcome of these wars. The wars with Daniel 9, Isaiah 28, Daniel 11, Psalms 83, Isaiah 17, Jeremiah 49, Isaiah 22, Zachariah 5, and Ezekiel 38. The outcome is absolute global catastrophe. And Revelation 6 verse 5 says, when he opened the third seal, I heard the living creature say, come and see. So I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. In Revelation 6 verse 6, and I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine. Certainly, first century, a denarius, was equal to a day's wages. Okay, so a quart of wheat was worth a day's wages. I've read up a bit on this. Most scholars agree that a quart of wheat and what they call 3 quarts of barley is basically enough just to keep a person alive. So you're spending your entire day's wages just to stay alive. And the whole do not harm the oil and the wine. Well, in ancient times, olive oil and wine were staples of the Mediterranean diet, along with grain. Now, some people have said, oh, these are luxuries, but it probably wasn't. It was probably actually part of their staple diet. And we can back that up with evidence in Deuteronomy 7:13, 11:14, Chronicles, so forth and so on. Okay. So basically, life becomes ridiculously hard. Mass probably famines. Yep. Revelation 6 verse 7, when he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, come and see. So I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the name of him who sat on it was Death and Hades. Now, I know I already covered that. The fact that that's actually exactly what the agreement of Isaiah 18 verse 18 is. They make an agreement with Death and Hades, and God punishes them for that. So on it was Death and Hades, followed with him, and power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by beasts of the earth. And we read there exactly in Daniel 11:29 verse 32, it says that at the appointed time, he shall return and go towards the south again. But it shall not be like the former or the latter, okay? So it's not necessarily global at this point, okay? For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the Holy Covenant. So he's actually worked out that he has limits. So he turns all of his aggression on the Holy Covenant. We'll talk about that in a minute. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. In other words, they follow after the beast, and that's in Revelation 13. We'll talk about that when we get there. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, and they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation, which we see in Revelation chapter 6 in just a few more verses. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see how all of these are lining up progressively, leading up to when the daily sacrifices are taken away. Daniel 9:27. For those who want to know Kittim, in Jeremiah 2 verse 10 and Ezekiel 27 verse 6, the Isles of Kittim are mentioned, and Josephus brings them up as well. If you don't know who Josephus is, he was a historian around the time of Jesus, and he wrote a whole stack of stuff. But it could literally be Cyprus. Yeah, all right. Most people think that that's where it's from. Which is interesting because I just saw very recently how Greece is actually helping out Israel currently. Yeah, so they've actually got quite a close bond there. So here we see it says, take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So Daniel 9:27, but in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be the one who makes desolate, even unto the consummation which is determined which is determined is poured out in the desolate. All right. So Matthew 24, we see this again. Jesus says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by prophet Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, for then there will be great tribulation. Okay, so here we got Jesus saying, up until this point, and we've just read that through the chapter Daniel 11, so up to this point, it's just tribulation. But when you see this happen, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't be, for then there will be great tribulation, since such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Which is the problem with preterism. Because preterism will say that all those things happened in AD 70, and they're not entirely wrong. But AD 70 it pales, to be honest, with the world wars that occurred since then. Okay, so, and Jesus says literally that when this happens, like, there will never ever be something as bad. And he's right. When this happens in the future, during the tribulation period, during this 10 days of tribulation, after that, there will never ever be something as bad as what God's going to pour out on the earth. So in Revelations 12, verse 6, there's that confirmation. It says that when the woman fled into the wilderness, then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there for 1,260 days. Okay, so flee to the mountains. And in Revelations 12, verse 6, like, yes, that's what's going to happen. And they're going to be there for 1,260 days till what's called Elul. Elul is the last month of the Hebrew calendar. It is called the month of repentance. Okay. So remember, this abomination that gets set up is right in the middle of the Isaiah 18:18 agreement, also that you read in Daniel 9:27. And here we have the problem with English. So Hebrew places the main focus first, like the actual subject matter first, and then the explanation after it. So for example, we say hot bread. Hebrew says bread hot, lechem cham. All right. So the most important part about bread is obviously the bread. How it got there and how it is the fact that it's hot. This is how we see it in scripture. So in Daniel 12, verse 11, one of the probably most difficult to understand verses in end time prophecy, and it's because we read it from an English point of view. It says this, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now remember, there's 1,260 days to Elul, the month of repentance. Israel repents for a month. Then you've got the first day of Yom Teruah, which equals 1,290 days. Okay? Because people are like, is it 1,260 or is it 1,290? It's like, it's both. But for the first 1,260 days, Israel is basically taken care of, and then they realize that they have sinned and they repent. The prefigure of that is when Joseph's brothers, when they came to Egypt and they saw Joseph, they mourned, they repented. And because Joseph saw them repent, then he came back. Right? Then he revealed himself to his brothers. And that's what we see here. Even though they're looked after, they get to a point where they're like, we've messed up. They repent for a month, and then Messiah reveals himself. All right? Then Daniel 12, verse 12 says this. It says, so straight after talking about the 1,290 days, he says, blessed is he who waits and comes. The Hebrew word there is nagah. It says, blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. And it's like, I always read all this scholarly work, and they're like, we don't know what it is. Like, is it 1,260 days? Is it 1,290 days? Wait, is it 1,335 days? It's like, the answer is all of them. But as I mentioned earlier, in the Hebrew language, the most important part, the focus, comes first. And how that is reached, or the adjective of it, comes next. And this is exactly what we see here. 1,290 days from the middle point. Blessed are those who have reached and gone through the 1,335 days before it. So Revelations chapter 6 is a 1,335 day period within a 10-year tribulation period. Because remember, Revelations 2, he talks about tribulation being for a 10-day period. So 10-day period, 7-year alliance. But for the first 1,335 days, all of Revelations 6 is being poured out onto the earth. And on the fourth horseman, that's when we see the agreement null and void. That's Daniel 9:27, in the middle of the 7 days, 7 years. Hope I haven't lost you there. Yeah. It's a lot to take in, but we've got to get through it. And honestly, if you read the notes, probably need to go over it a few times. So in Isaiah 28 verse 18, it says, your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it. And remember, that's exactly what happens with the fourth horseman. It says, in the name of him who sat on it was death and Hades. And the power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger and death, and by beasts of the earth. All right. So the scourge passes through, then you'll be trampled down by it. Remember, Daniel 11 verse 40 explains the initial reaction of Daniel 11:31. So when they take away the daily sacrifices and place the abomination of desolation up, all hell breaks loose. And it says in Daniel 11 verse 40, it says, at that time, so when the abomination is put up, the king of the south attacks him. He's like, whoa, wait, we were wrong. This guy isn't any good. He just put up his, idol in the temple. So at that time, the king of the south attacks him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and it's the same term, and shall pass through. All right? That is when God made that promise. He's like, because you made a covenant with death, the scourge will pass through, and you will be trampled down by it. I've already mentioned this, but remember with the 1,335 days, everything is bad, but this is the pinnacle of it. All right? And those who manage to reach this moment, blessed are they, because they've reached that moment, and they should go, wow, now we know what's up. And again, 1150 days for the sacrifices. All right, I'm just repeating myself there, so I'll go on. All right, Revelation 6 verse 9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. Revelation 6 verse 10. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Because remember, there has just been wars everywhere. Then a white robe was given to each one of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. So again, this is confirmation that this isn't the end. All right? This is not the end. There's a whole stack of other bad stuff that's going to happen for the last 1,260 days. So what we're seeing here in Revelation 6:9 is the people who died during the wars leading up to taking away the daily sacrifices, that's the Tamid sacrifice, and placing there the abomination of desolation. All right, and that's when the revolt occurs that we just read in Daniel. So Revelation 6 verse 8, this is actually an interesting point, and I want you to have a think about this. Remember, this is just a theory. It says, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth. Statistically, 1/4 of the earth's population actually calls themselves Christian. So this could be the 6 out of 7 churches that were, obviously not Philadelphia, that has been kept from the cycle of time, but this could be them. Now, Daniel 11 verse 30 does say that he returns in rage against the holy covenant. Doesn't actually mention that it's necessarily just Israel, but he rages against the holy covenant. And I think he specifically mentions here the holy covenant because Daniel could see that in future there were many who were grafted into the covenant. It was not just Israel. And I've already gone through this in previous sessions, so we're going to go through this real quick. We know that this is when the covenant is broken, and we know that this is the beginning of the Great Tribulation because, again, Revelation 6:12, Revelation 6:13, the same things will happen. The sun becomes black, the moon like blood, and the stars fall to earth. And we can see that in so many of the prophets, it literally says that is when the day of the Lord, that is when the wrath begins specifically. But I went through that in previous weeks, so we're just going to move on. So Revelation 6 verse 14, it says, then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain on earth, every mountain and island was moved out of its place. The Greek word there, apokaorizo, it actually means to separate and to sever. This is really an explanation of how the stars looked when they fell. It looked like the sky had been torn, like you would on a scroll if you tore pages apart. Which we see there again, exactly at the midpoint, like we just saw all these prophecies here. See, like the day shall be darkened, the stars of heaven fell to the earth. Revelation 6 verse 13. All right. So that's what he did. He looked up and he could just see the sky fall apart. Revelation 6 verse 15 says, and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave, basically every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Okay, so they've worked out the wrath has just started. For the great day of his wrath has come. It's started now. Okay, so you've got the day of the Lord for sure. This is his wrath that's just started. And who is able to stand? So Daniel 11:31 verse 45 then goes and actually explains the great tribulation that occurs over the next 42 months from that moment, from the Revelations 6:15 moment. Okay, so sun's gone dark, blood moon, or moon's been darkened. The stars are falling from the sky. Everyone's worked out that God's wrath has just started. And then we see an explanation here in Daniel 11. It says, and forces shall be mustered by him, the king of the north, and shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. Okay, so he really hates the holiness of the covenant. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. So that's good news. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And those are the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame. We just saw that in Revelations, that even though a whole stack of people had died, Jesus said to them, no, there's more who are going to die. They shall die by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now, when they shall fall, they shall be aided with a little help. That's explained in Revelations 11 when we get there. But many shall join with them by intrigue. Okay, so a lot of people are like, wow, who is this amazing man? Okay, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, and to make them white. It's exactly what we saw, we're going to see in Revelation 7 verse 14. So they're falling, they're dying to purify and to make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Now we read about that appointed time in Ezekiel 39 and Joel 3, where the nations all get together to try and take on God. And of course, Daniel 11, verse 44 to 45 sums up his worldwide rage and also his end. And this is what it says. It says, but news from the east and the north trouble him. Therefore, he goes out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He just goes on a blood rampage worldwide. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, because remember, he's still obsessed with Israel. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. God will take him out. So when it says here, carry out great exploits, they shall be aided with a little help. We do see that. We see that during the treading of the holy city for 42 months, we have got the two witnesses. All right. In the fourth beast, we can see that the holy people will be delivered into his hands for time and just for time and times and a half a time. All right. But it's actually part of the process of their purifying and making them white. So God was like, this is part of your purification. Okay. Israel was scattered into the wilderness for 1,260 days, but is actually looked after. And honestly, it's probably by Egypt as well. We see that in Revelations 12, verse 6. And they're protected up until the month of Elul, where you have the month of repentance. 30 days later, which completes the full 1,290 days, you've got the last trumpet, which begins the 10 days of awe. And that's called the 7 plagues. In Revelation 7, verse 14, we see that, yes, this is part of the purifying of many. These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So you can see the correspondence here in Daniel 11, where it talks about them falling, and that's what purifies them and makes them white. And then that's exactly what we read in Revelation 7, verse 14, that this is the purifying of many. These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. In consideration of Thyatira in Revelations 2:22, he actually does say that those who are not following after him, they're committing adultery with other gods, the Jezebel, he'll actually throw them into the Great Tribulation. So this is probably them. So the fourth beast of Daniel 9 and Daniel 11, it says, then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. That's his end. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall neither regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor the regard of any god. For he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, a God which his father did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. He does actually go on a worldwide conquer fest. And we see that in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 14, that this is the person who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, all right? So Revelation 13, verse 4 says, so they worship the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like this beast, who is able to make war with him? The blasphemies against the God of gods, we see that in Revelation 13, verse 5 as well. And that occurs for a time, times, and half a time. Trying to get through this, sorry. So the sixth seal is actually the end of the tribulation and the beginning of God's revenge. So outlined here, 1, there's an agreement. It's an unholy alliance in Isaiah 18, verse 18, but it only lasts 1,335 days. The temple is restored. It only takes a few months, and then the sacrifices are restored, and they go for 1,150 days up until that middle point as well, where God begins his cleansing. He begins his cleansing with his wrath. Yes, he uses trampling as a cleansing. There's too many examples to put here, but we could begin with Babylon and the diaspora, all right? In this case, he hands over the treading for 42 months. We read that in Revelations 11, Daniel 12, and Daniel 9, right? And then Israel finally repents in Elul. And we've already gone through the fact that, yes, the sacrifices will last 1,150 days. We can move on from there. Let's talk about Mark 13 very quickly, and then we can finish. How are we going for time? All right. Mark 13, unfortunately, should just not be read in verses. You know, you'll hear me say, if ever you come and do life groups and those things, chapters and titles. Yeah. Chapters and titles are one of the, they make doctrine. People make doctrines out of chapters and titles, because one chapter in the English mindset means that's the end of that one. And then it's something different started. But there were not any verses or chapters in any original writings. It just helps us find places. So I don't mind chapters and verses, of course, because it actually has helped with finding parts of the Bible. But if you just stick to that mentality, you'll always have an English reading mentality, and it creates strange doctrine. All right, so Mark 13, 8 to 13 is the 6 seals, okay? I'm not going to read it all right now because we've got enough time. So the first few verses there, 8 to 13, is actually what's happening in the 6 seals. In Mark 13, verse 14, he says, "But when the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet, Daniel the prophet, is standing, he says, 'Take heed, behold, I have foretold you all things.'" Okay, so he's saying that you've got all these things that happen, and then the abomination of desolation is set up. And in verse 23, he says, "But it's okay. I've foretold you these things." It's interesting. This could actually be another claim that he was the one who was speaking to Daniel. So he may have been saying, "I was the one, the great I am, who was speaking to Daniel here." In Mark 13, 24, 25, he says, "And then he explains what to look for after the tribulation. But in those days, after the tribulation, the sun will be dark and the moon won't give its light. The stars of heaven will fall and the powers of heaven will be shaken." Okay. So he's saying you've got this tribulation, you've got the horsemen, you've got all this tribulation. You'll know the moment it finishes because the abomination's set up. And then as soon as that happens, the sun's darkened, the moon won't give its light, the stars of heaven fall. Then this is the weird part. In Mark 13, verse 26, he says, "And then he will send his angels and gather the elect." Okay? So it looks, sorry, Matthew 13, verse 26. I think I said that, yes. He says, "And then." It looks, a lot of people think that, okay, as soon as the sun is darkened, the moon loses its light and the stars fall from heaven, that straight after that is when Jesus they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And it does look like that if you just read it in English, one verse after another. But if you get rid of the verses and just read it in the text, he's wrapping it up. That says these bad things are going to happen in the tribulation. You're going to see the abomination set up. When that happens, the sun's going to be darkened, the moon's not going to give its light. And the listeners at that point would have known that, yes, that is the start of the wrath, because they would have known Daniel 11. So Jesus wraps it up in verse 25 and in verse 26. He says, "And then the Son of Man then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the furthest parts of the earth to the furthest parts of heaven." This is a wrap-up statement. It isn't a timeline statement. It isn't a straight after you see the sun darkened, that this is going to happen. No, he's just explaining you've got a tribulation, you've got a middle part, and then you're going to have an end. And the end comes with everyone seeing the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. But again, everyone just likes there to be a timeline. So where is the Philadelphia church? Yes, we're nearly finished. Well, just like there's 10 plagues, but Israel was kept from the last 7 plagues in the land of Goshen. If you read it through, Israel endured the first 3. So too in Revelations 2 verse 10, we're having 10 days of tribulation, but Philadelphia is kept from the last 7. That's what it looks like. Remember, they're protected from the hour. The Greek word there's horror, which means cycle of time, a season. Some people say, oh no, that Philadelphia church is kept from the hour of judgment, but that's not what it says. It says that they're kept from the trial of temptation. And when we get to Revelations 8 verse 1, I've mentioned this earlier as well, like in previous sessions. Revelations 8 verse 1 does explain to a point that the second half of the hour begins and all heaven is quiet while the day of wrath occurs. Okay, so are we raptured? Some people would, is the Philadelphia church raptured out of it? Some say certainly, others would say, or maybe they're just kept in the land of Goshen and protected. Okay, but I think I've made it clear from the very outset, I'm not going to open that rabbit hole. Or maybe I will at the end, but certainly not today. The good news is that in Daniel 32, whoever is going through the Great Tribulation will do great exploits. I did yeshiva class just recently, again, another class. And it's very interesting. Rabbi brought it up. I didn't. So the rabbi of the yeshiva, for those who don't know, yeshiva is rabbinical college. I didn't bring this up. This was actually Rabbi just brought it up. And he was saying, it's interesting that in the book of Revelations, as God comes closer, as the time of God comes closer, because God cannot absorb sin, he doesn't absorb sin, he reflects it. And as God gets closer, he's like a mirror. And he reflects sin right back at the world. So the world gets worse. Like sin just gets crazy. Sin self-reflects on itself. But in the same course, the righteousness of God also reflects back on itself and increases dramatically. And so you get this massive separation between a sinful world and a righteous, powerful, godly world. Both cohabitating, but it does say, and I like Daniel 11 verse 32, it says, they shall do great exploits. Next week, Revelations chapter 7 will not be like today as so intense. We will talk about who are the 144,000 and where is Dan, the tribe of Dan. We'll see in Revelation chapter 7, there's actually great hope, even in the great tribulation, because God's plan is for salvation. Even remember his wrath, we were talking about this last week. Even God's wrath is his love, and his plan is always for salvation.